cast your mind back. It's November 1994. And I can't even go one slide without a joke. I used to give this talk. I'm giving this talk a lot. I used to give this talk and I would say, what were you doing in 1994? And when the median response became waiting to be conceived, I decided to stop asking that question. So it's 1994. There's a Clinton in the White House. This was a lot funnier like 5 years ago. Number one movie, 1994. Tom Cruise. See if you can catch the Easter egg in there. And you could order books. And this is the glorious beauty of HTML layouts before tables arrived. And there's also the how you would order that book involved. Something else happened in 1994. The Python community started. And that'll be the topic, the starting point of this conversation, of this presentation. And I do want it to be a format as a conversation, which is kind of weird because I'm staring at my wall and talking to some inanimate devices, but I'm looking down at Slack and I can look at your comments and riff on them because I'll be honest, part of my job is to entertain you, but part of your job is to entertain me too. So let's see if we can make this into a unique presentation by coming up with some ideas. You don't have to just ask questions. You can bring up things you think are fun to talk about. A little bit about me. I like to joke. I'm the luckiest duck of all the lucky duckies. I get to be a JetBrains advocate. I should pay them my salary. Don't tell them, etc. It's a great job working on PyCharm and WebStorm. Now, relevant to this conversation, I've been in the room when some things happen, including the 1994 topic of this. I was a bootstrapper with Greg Stein of the Python Software Foundation. I was involved with some things that start with Z and Ps. And in 1993, I did a website, www.navy.mil. And on that point, this is the first evidence of me on the internet that Google can find. This is so hilarious. Asking a tech support question and getting possibly the top venture capitalists in the world, tech venture capitalists in the world to reply. His path and mine took different directions after this interaction. So what was going on before 1994 that kind of sets the scene for this? There's a great article that was written, I think, maybe like 2 years ago, year and a half ago. Oh, no, it says here. Yeah, 2 years ago-ish, in ZDNet. And Nick, the journalist, I felt he did a really good framing of what happened at the beginning, captured all the key points about Guido's work with ABC and Amoeba and the downtime when he conceived of doing another programming language and what kind of got it off the ground. This is the milieu. Hopefully, Calvin, you're not going to criticize me on the pronunciation of that. The milieu that we were in at the time, there was this class of things called scripting languages, and they were kind of viewed as toys. And you wouldn't do anything legitimate in a scripting language. Maybe you would do a prototype and the grown-ups would come back later and convert it to C or C++. But they were starting to be something involved with the web even before when I got involved. And so that is actually my origin story for Python. When I was doing Navy.mil, and there was this thing before CGI. It was the same idea though, standard out, standard in, forking a process and stuff like that. And I wanted to do a little bit of dynamic stuff, and I could have done what people were doing at the time, and I could have done it in C. Probably not going to happen. Could have done it in Bash. Yeah, not so much. But Perl was a scripting language, and that was what everybody seemed to be using. So I've got this really vivid memory. Unlike all my other stories, this one's true. Go into the bookstore in the computer book section. I mean, it was just a shelf, really small. And there was a Perl book in my local bookstore. So and it's this Perl book, the Camel book, and I pick it off, and I had this memory of going like, oh, hell no. Putting it back on the shelf, and there was this downloadable PostScript file for this scripting language called Python. Don't even know how I stumbled across it. And damn if that tutorial wasn't like written for Paul Everitt's brain specifically. It just fit my brain so well. I printed it out. I've got a hilarious story for later about where I was when I went through that tutorial. It's actually kind of embarrassing, but I love telling it. This, another funny story, the Python book on here is, I believe, what's considered the first Python book. Aaron did most of the writing on it. And they needed a logo, and we actually had a graphics artist in digital creations at the time. And I remember going over to Nancy and saying, hey, can you do this book logo? Can you do the cover art for this book? And Nancy said, well, what should be on it? And asking an engineer, a programmer for creative is just, you get, actually, this is what you get. And I said, I don't know, a snake and some glasses because Guido wears glasses and a can of Spam. And there you go, the cover art for the first Python book. Python had a mailing list at the time. And it's actually kind of funny. In 1993, when you wanted to list your website, you actually emailed Tim Berners-Lee, which is pretty hilarious. And that's what I did when I listed Navy.mil. And when you wanted to join the Python community and get on the mailing list, you actually emailed Guido. He actually edited the etsy aliases file. And we gave this talk as a keynote panel at PyCon like 3 years ago. And Guido said he knew that he had advanced to actually having a community when he could assign that job to somebody else. This is actually the very first email in the mailing list, like the origin of the Python community writ large. Welcome to the mailing list. And this is a funny follow-up. It's all kind of funny because he also talks about explaining people in the top how to do quotes. But then at the bottom, look at that. He says, someday I'll put in a decent parser. Guess what was in Python 3.9? The peg parser. So hope springs eternal. This is great when live, so I'll do it. Pretend live. Raise your hand if you know what UUCP in POTS stands for. Since you can go figure it out for yourself, I won't spoil it. But this is like the step past mailing lists to news groups. And getting it, there's a source of a funny story. Comp Lang Python was the name of the news group. And it was really a mirror to the mailing list. Despite the comp, despite the Lang, people looked at Python and thought it was a Monty Python fan group. Guido's like half the messages in the beginning were about Monty Python skits. For anyone that knows me or anything about my history, this is hilarious. My very first email to the mailing list, and I'm doing all the ZOAP crap and the ZODB crap. It's kind of hilarious. Here's a meme that has gone on through the years, was resolved recently, and look at that. June 94 is the origin of the "What if Guido got hit by a bus" meme by Michael McLay, whose name will come up later as a real hero in getting this all going. So this is actually a fun, if you want to go Google for this in the mailing list archives and read the follow-ups on this. It's actually kind of forward-looking for the Python community before there was perhaps even a Python community to be thinking about these kinds of things. Another funny tidbit, very early on, Guido expressed his lack of enthusiasm about lambdas. And I think I actually saw last month, he's actually considering maybe some alternative syntax to make lambdas a little bit more useful. Then Python in 1994, the thing happened that is the topic of this. Michael and Guido organized a workshop. Michael McLay, working at NIST. Barry and I were on with Michael Kennedy. We did Python 1994 on Michael's podcast. I've got a link to it later in this presentation. And the the fact that it was at NIST wound up being one of those dominoes. And the whole reason we're here has a sequence of dominoes that you could easily imagine removing one of those dominoes and we're not here. And so Michael organized a workshop, and we joked about it, 20 people, what are we going to do with all that room? So it was a NIST office, little conference room in Gaithersburg, Maryland, no windows, steel chairs, just really swank. Here's a list of some of the things that we had on the agenda for the first Python workshop, Spam 1, as it was known. Some of these are fun to me in retrospect because of Zope, like number 1 and number 3. Number 8 was kind of interesting. This is something I've added to this presentation because of where Python is now. Python, in the third of Python, it kind of could have gone into decline, but the arrival of data science gave it a second life. And let's face it, data science, most of it isn't in Python. It's in C, running over on the GPU, and Python provides a little glue language, which was what its raison d'etre was in the very beginning, to be a glue language to things in C. And so from the very beginning, there needed to be a more organized story for C extensions, which also happens to be a hot topic right now because of sub-interpreters. They're trying to clean up the C API or make a new C API and do things without breaking NumPy. And it's a very vigorous discussion. And then the last one's kind of funny to me because Michael and I went off on the side. The community was 20 people big and we're writing bylaws. How dumb is that? These are some pictures from the conference. Top one is Roger Massey talking to Guido with Barry, Michael McClay. Then there's a picture of Barry. I joke, this is what Barry looks like on the inside. Then Jim Fulton, and then me before I got married and learned you can't spend more than $5 on a haircut. What was it like at this November 1994 workshop in Joseph Stalin's favorite architecture building in Gaithersburg, Maryland? In that article I mentioned at the beginning, this was the lead-in of the article. I said it's a great article, but the very first sentence gets into gross exaggerations. I'm not against gross exaggerations. A select group of programmers. Sure. So this is Barry talking a little bit about something that really is a vivid memory of his, that even then, people viewed Python as something that was a super advantage to what they were doing. So coming out of that workshop, some things then started to happen, and I'll refer to it as the first third of Python. Some things that started to happen that came from that first workshop. My goodness, did we get a lot of these emails over and over. I can't be bothered to go look at the archives. So could you please pre-chew my food for me and explain how you stack up against Perl and Tickle? But still, some of these points are kind of fun to look at. I will pause for a moment, let you look at some of these points and say, do you think that there's still issues? You know, if you watched Russell Keith McGee's Black Swan keynote from a couple of years ago, can you spot any of the things that he talked about are occurring in there? So then there was a second workshop. We wound up having two workshops in 1995, both hosted by Jim Fulton. This was in a window-full Joseph Stalin government office building in Menlo Park, California. Steel chairs again. Thanks, Jim. This one was kind of fun for a couple of reasons. One, the point below, wow, we actually might fill up a 20-person room this time. But I've got some memories from this that I think are true. They're true enough for me. This was the first time we heard of Java. Somebody gave a presentation about Sun's set-top programming language that didn't have the name Java yet. I remember a presentation from the Stanford Digital Library people that wound up being later Google, because the crawler in Google was written in Python. So some interesting things going on in that workshop. And then, dun, 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 the Python Software Foundation was launched. No, not the successful Python Software Foundation. The unsuccessful Python Software Activity was launched. This would be a good episode just on its own to talk about what we thought we were doing, what problem we were trying to solve, how we went about it, how we fell into kind of the classic mistakes of consortiums rather than communities and things like that. Please do not send in cash. That's funny. The way the community was organized a little bit in those years was special interest groups. I think that kind of mimics maybe the IETF or something like that model. And I have the pleasure of forming the very first SIG that was unsuccessful. And it's this one, the catalog SIG that Andrew Kuchling actually took over later. If you want to think about what it was supposed to be, PyPI is what it was supposed to be. And it was dismal. I should just stick to making coffee for the smart people. Then, and this is something I added to this presentation because of everything that's going on in Python now with data science. And back then it was numeric in presentations at SPAM 3. Python is a glue language, right? Gluing together stuff written in other languages. But the way that you have that interface to the other languages, is it standardized? Is it productive? Is it safe? All those other things. And so, and Jim Fulton, early hero of the world of Python, I think is considered the champion of formalizing the C API at the time. Maybe we can get him back to help pitch in on the new C API that's rumbling around now. And when you look at it, damn if Python 1.3 bullet number 2 in the release notes, which are in this help-based system that was popular back then, wasn't the bullet number 2 in Python 1.3 was Jim's C API. Jim went on to do some other work on extension class and the new style objects. Here is the agenda for the third Python workshop. And this is where things get to be a little more interesting. It gets to be bigger. It's at USGS in Reston, and it's in their kind of amphitheater. I don't know, if I was to guess, maybe right at 80 to 100 people, but multiple tracks of things, multiple groupings of interest with people leading those groupings. I was doing the web stuff. And I will abuse the privilege of talking and give another personal story. I was doing basically CGI. I was doing a tutorial on CGI. And in the audience was Greg Stein. And we had just released this before Jim started working with us. We had just released something that ran in Apache and used Corba, using a system called ILU from Xerox PARC, a free Corba implementation, to talk to long-running processes. And we had this little object publisher thing. And there's a tech report on W3C about it. So I'm giving a tutorial, and then I go over that part a little bit. Want to speed up your CGI stuff? Have a long-running process. This was before Fast CGI. And in the audience was Greg Stein, who was at eShop with Pierre Omidyar. And they wound up adopting that and then getting bought by Microsoft. eShop got bought by Microsoft. And the first Microsoft Commerce server that shipped was written in Python. It was eShop. So that was a pretty cool thing to see that Python, even in this, they probably got bought in 96 or something like that, that Python could be thought of that seriously at that time. Another little funny follow-on from that, the next SPAM, so this would have been SPAM 3. So SPAM 4, I was supposed to do the CGI tutorial just before it, wound up going to fonts instead for vacation. And sorry, but am I going to go to Lawrence Livermore? Am I going to go to fonts? What would you do? I think you know what you would do. And Jim Fulton had just joined us in 96, and he was obviously going to the conference. And he said, I'll give the tutorial, but I don't know anything about CGI. which is like Jim Fulton in a nutshell. I'll just learn it on the flight there. So we learned it on the flight there. Jim is totally object oriented. Did a lot of work with GNU Smalltalk, I think. And on the flight back, he conceived in his head and wrote what became Bobo and object publishing before there was REST. And so little moment of serendipity because I chose wisely to go on vacation. Now I'll expand this part a little bit because of what Barry said in the podcast with Michael. Barry was at CNRI in November 1994. CNRI is the Corporation National Resource Initiatives. And who just made, so Eli, now you know 3 things about Reston. It's in Reston, Virginia. CNRI was a pretty distinguished place. It had a big relationship with DARPA, but it was like a DARPA that wasn't in the government. And it was headed by Bob Kahn, who could rightfully call himself the father of the internet because he was the boss of Vint Cerf when the two of them started working on TCP. And Bob ran CNRI, which was basically a consortium nonprofit kind of thing that would get funding to go do projects. And I believe Roger Massey and Barry were both at CNRI when they went to the first workshop. But the key point here is that Barry had been at NIST before. And so that was how Python kind of jumped from Guido comes over for a workshop at NIST, hooks up with CNRI, and winds up moving here to work at CNRI and to have this group of people, Python Labs, working there on funded projects like NoBots, mobile code, a browser written here, Grail, a browser written in Python that uses all of the beautiful glory of tkinter. So that group was, hopefully I won't forget the names, Guido, Roger, Jeremy, Ken, leaving somebody else out, Fred. And so Python got a home where it could incubate. Very important point in Python's history. It also got a bit of organizing because CNRI and Fortech, which is in the next slide, ran the IETF meetings, ran the World Wide Web conferences, knew how to do contracts and bank accounts and consortium-like things in the public interest. We'll talk perhaps a little bit later about some of the sharp edges of that. But without going to NIST for that workshop, meaning without Michael McLay, and without going to CNRI, we're definitely not here today. Let's talk a little bit about this thing called Fortech. They were a conference organizing activity that was used to doing things on a really big scale. And so they converted us from spam to International Python Conference. And you see here a page for, I believe, the last International Python Conference in Long Beach before the wheels came off the bus and the first third of Python ended in my book. And you can kind of see this point about this was different than spam 1 by that thing at the bottom. There's and my logo down there, Digital Creations. Actually, I think that is my logo. Did I do that stupid spinning thing? Maybe. The transition from spam 1 to IPC was an attempt to grow up, to be more professional, to be more in the industry, to do things like the big boys and girls would do. It didn't work. We were still the rabble. We were still the bazaar, not the cathedral. And thank goodness later on, the PSF and PyCon went back to a volunteer organized, community focused kind of organization. But still, this was part of the first third of Python. back then, these paths that we might go through now, like 6 Feet Up doing this conference, that wasn't the way things were back then. It wasn't as community focused. It was more getting big names and big companies in. So then closing off this first third of Python, in my book at least, kind of coinciding with the dot-com bubble bursting, things didn't work out so well I don't want to say they didn't work out so well. Things happened at CNRI involving licensing and trying to milk the cow or squeeze the juice out of the lemon, or however you want to view it. And it was time to move on. And being the dot-com era, there's gold in them there hills. And so the Python Labs group packed up. I could do the Beverly Hillbillies right now, but that would be cringy. Packed up, went west to a startup called Be Open. And Be Open was kind of cashing in on open source. They were going to do value add things around open source, headed by someone who had a community, I believe, in XEmax or something like that, Bob Weiner. That lasted 6 months. And unfortunately, the Python Labs team was about to be kind of scattered to the winds. We had just done our third big round of financing. And so we wound up having the Python Labs team come join us at Digital Creations. Guido worked full-time on Python. The other folks worked like 2 days out of 5 on Python or something like that. So I kind of view 2000 as this pivot point of the first third of Python. Before going on, I'll try and read back a little bit through some of the messages. Yeah, Python Cabal, there was a little feeling of that. And Martijn Fossen does a good joke about the Python secret underground, because those Dutch people, you really can't trust them. All right. And yeah, some things about dial-up, which are kind of funny. So with this in mind, I enjoy talking about this first third of Python, and I would be interested, for example, Calvin talking about when Guido announced Python 3000. Calvin, can you get me the date for Python 3000 and post it in here to see if it kind of lines up with this whole pivot point thing? I hate to say it, pivot point for my reality when we started launching Zope 3, which was unsuccessful.
I would say that was 2004, 5?
2004. Okay, so it doesn't fit completely in my timeline. Okay. But it's kind of a similar thing. Things are in transition as we're moving from an early stage to a middle stage. If you're interested in more riffing on this, Barry's point of view, we've got Michael's podcast. The finished version is on the left. And then we did a live stream with all the raw material on the right, and kind of give a little more personal impressions about how we felt about things, and talked a little bit more about things like what were we kind of thinking? Were there things you could look back then and say, okay, that led to this? And one of the biggest points of that, Jim Fulton brought this up when we did the keynote panel. Back then, at least, and it's still true in some cases, not every programming community was nice and sweet and kind. And Python was nice and sweet and kind and established a culture of being inviting. And Jim brought this up, that Python was kind and human because Guido was kind and human. It kind of took on the nature of its creator. And then it kind of attracted a group that believed in those things as the first group, which then meant the much bigger group could see that as kind of settling in as the culture. Something like that becomes really important because just at the time in the middle of third Python, when Python could have peaked, when web development, which was really the driver of Python, kind of crested and people started doing web development and other things, instead of going down, it had this dip and climb related, in my opinion, to two things. First, as an engine of PyCon and the PSF and the dogged determination of Jessica McKellar and PyLadies, Python made a strategic decision, put money behind it to change the gender and diversity equation. And from 2004, when there were, I believe, 3% of the PyCon talks were by women, 3 years later, it was, I believe, 34%. And then up a little bit after that and a little bit after that. So having a culture from the beginning that was warm and inviting and said, hey, we care about you, came back later to help Python, in my opinion, avoid the dip and go on another growth. And then that extended later to data science, which data scientists don't necessarily think of themselves as programmers. And so they show up in a programmer community, and you can imagine some of these communities talking down to them, making them feel unwanted. Instead, they land in Python and find a home, find a tribe, and then Python, something like I joke, 120% of Python people showed up yesterday for data science. The data science influx has been tremendous. All right, on to the best words in any presentation. This is a screenshot of Eva giving the keynote at Pi Colorado, which was the last in-person time that I gave this talk. It's kind of funny. I was given the talk then, you can see it on the recording. That part in the presentation where I said the first time we heard the name Java, I did it really melodramatically. I was like, and then we heard about Java. I swear to goodness, as soon as I said about Java, there was this thunder, shook the whole room. She gave this presentation. I thought she ended it really well and helped me later to give the Python 1994 talk. You know, you look at these people that were involved in Python in the first third, or the second third, or the current third. There will be many thirds. And you think, oh, they're rock stars, or they're the heroes, or they're the whatevers. But they were the ones, we were all sitting in the audience at some point. And so Eva's point is Python will be what you want it to be. The people leading Python will be you. The future person getting up and giving her keynote will be someone sitting in the room. And I thought that was a nice tie-in back to the beginning of Python and that workshop, starting in these really modest, humble origins, not really expecting to become what's considered the #1 growing programming language in the world, not considering that Capital One would have a 500-acre booth at PyCon. Never would have seen that coming at Spam One. That was an unusual outcome. And so I like to kind of close this on Python 1994 is fun to talk about. It's fun to learn lessons from. It's fun to project back and then project forward and see where we came from to help know where we're going. But really, at the end of the day, where we're going is where you're going. Get involved, do the things you love, bring joy and purpose, and let's have you be the next heroes of Python.